The Texas night stretched long and quiet, the road ahead empty except for the glow of streetlights casting flickering shadows on the pavement. Earl E.J. Jackson kept his hands steady on the wheel, the deep rumble of his old pickup truck humming beneath him. He had just left the grocery store, a six-pack of beer and a loaf of bread on the passenger seat. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Yet, as he crossed through a four-way stop, the flash of red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror. He sighed, "Not again." Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. EJ slowed the truck and pulled over to the side of the road, his pulse steady, his mind already working through the steps. Engine off, interior lights on, hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. This wasn't his first time getting stopped for driving while black. The crunch of boots on asphalt signaled their approach. Two officers, one older, built like a linebacker, his uniform tight around his broad chest. Sergeant Dave Wilkins. EJ recognized him. A veteran on the force, the kind who used to know the difference between right and wrong before the job beat it out of him. The second officer was younger, cocky, a little too eager, Deputy Kyle Brooks. EJ had seen his type before, hungry for power, but too dumb to understand it. Brooks approached first, one hand on his belt, his flashlight already blinding EJ through the open window. "License and registration," Brooks demanded, his tone sharp, aggressive. EJ exhaled through his nose. "Mind telling me why I got pulled over, officer?" Brooks smirked. "Routine check." That was bullshit, and they both knew it. EJ didn't argue. He reached slowly for his wallet, careful, deliberate. He had been trained for high-stress situations long before these two were even wearing badges. He pulled out his license and registration, handing them over without a word. Wilkins lingered near the passenger side, peering into the truck. His eyes landed on the grocery bag, then the back seat, as if expecting to find something. "What's in the bag?" Wilkins asked. "Bread and beer," EJ said. "You want one?" Wilkins didn't laugh. Brooks, on the other hand, let out a sharp chuckle, though it wasn't friendly. "You been drinking tonight, Mr. Jackson?" Brooks asked, flipping through the license. EJ narrowed his eyes. "That a real question, or just something you say to every black man you pull over at night?" Brooks's smirk faltered. His grip on the flashlight tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." EJ didn't move. For what? Brooks took a step closer, the scent of cheap cologne and arrogance clinging to him. "Because I said so." Wilkins shifted, glancing at Brooks. EJ saw the hesitation flicker in his eyes. He knew this was going too far, but he didn't stop it. That's when EJ knew. This wasn't a traffic stop. This was a power play, a test, to see if he would fold. EJ inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had a choice. He could argue, push back, demand his rights, or dash. He could play their game. For now. So he exhaled, calm and controlled, then reached for the door handle and stepped out. And that's when everything changed. The air outside was thick with the kind of heat that clung to the skin, the humidity making every breath feel heavier. EJ stood tall as he stepped onto the pavement, his hands loose at his sides, his stance relaxed. Not out of submission, out of control. Deputy Kyle Brooks didn't know it yet, but the second EJ stepped out of that truck, the game had already changed. "Hands on the hood!" Brooks barked, stepping in closer, his fingers twitching near his holster. EJ didn't move. "Something wrong with your ears, old man?" EJ met his gaze, calm, unshaken. "That's a funny thing to say to someone who served longer than you've been alive." Brooks sneered. "That's supposed to impress me?" "No," EJ said. "It's supposed to warn you." Wilkins exhaled, shifting his weight uncomfortably. EJ saw it, the doubt creeping into the older officer's face. He wasn't fully on board with this, but he wasn't stopping it either. That was the problem with men like Wilkins. They weren't bad, but they let bad things happen. "Get your hands on the hood," Brooks snapped again, stepping even closer. EJ sighed. "You got probable cause for this search, or are we just pretending the law don't exist tonight?" Brooks' face darkened. His hand jerked toward his taser. EJ didn't flinch. "You sure you want to do that?" EJ asked, his voice dropping lower. Brooks hesitated, not out of fear, out of confusion. He was used to people getting angry, yelling, resisting. But this man, he was too calm, too steady, and that scared him more than anything. "You're real mouthy for someone who don't got a badge," Brooks muttered. EJ exhaled through his nose. Then he reached into his jacket pocket. Wilkins immediately went rigid. "Hands where I can see them." EJ kept his movements slow, deliberate. "Relax, Sergeant, just grabbing my ID." Brooks's grip on his taser tightened, his breath shallow. "I said—" EJ pulled out a badge, not a police badge, a Department of Justice identification card. The reflection of the cruiser's flashing lights gleamed against the official lettering, Office of Civil Rights Investigations. Wilkins cursed under his breath. Brooks froze, his eyes darting between the badge and EJ's unreadable expression. "You ever hear of the DOJ Civil Rights Division, Deputy Brooks?" EJ asked, his voice cool as steel. Brooks blinked. "What?" EJ flipped open the ID holder, revealing his active status as a federal investigator. "I investigate cases of racial profiling and police misconduct," EJ continued, tilting his head slightly. "You know, stops just like this one." Wilkins looked like he wanted to disappear. Brooks took a slow step back, his grip on his taser finally loosening. This some kind of joke?" EJ gave a slow, knowing smile. "No, son," he said. "This is karma." Brooks' breathing turned shallow, his eyes flicking back to Wilkins as if searching for backup. But Wilkins didn't say a word, because he knew exactly what was happening. EJ took a step forward, his voice never rising, never trembling. "So, let's talk about what's going to happen next," EJ said. "You're going to give me my license back, you're going to get back in that squad car, and you're going to drive away before you add obstruction of a federal officer to the list of mistakes you made tonight." Brooks's jaw clenched. "You don't have jurisdiction here," he spat. EJ let out a slow chuckle. "You sure about that?" Wilkins was sweating now. "Give him his damn license," Wilkins muttered. Brooks hesitated, but the weight of reality was crushing him now. His hand trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the driver's license. EJ took it back, sliding it into his wallet like it was just another boring night. "Good," EJ said, nodding once. "Now, go ahead. Get in your car and think real hard about how bad you just screwed up." Brooks looked like he wanted to argue, but for the first time in his career, he had no power in this situation. EJ had taken it from him without throwing a single punch. Brooks finally turned, storming back toward the squad car, his entire body rigid with barely contained rage. Wilkins lingered for half a second, eyes locking onto EJ. "This gonna go in a report?" Wilkins asked. EJ smiled. "What do you think?" Wilkins sighed, shaking his head. He didn't argue. He just followed Brooks back to the cruiser, the weight of consequences finally catching up. EJ watched them drive away. Then, slowly, he climbed back into his truck, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. He'd had some good nights in his life, some victories that felt like they truly mattered. But this was one of the sweetest. Because justice doesn't always come with sirens. Sometimes it comes with silence. And sometimes it comes in the form of a black veteran who refuses to be anybody's victim. EJ sat in his truck for a moment before driving off, his fingers still resting on the steering wheel, his mind sharp despite the calm expression on his face. He had seen this play out before, a bad cop flexing power he didn't earn, humiliating people because he could. The difference this time, he had made sure the wrong man got the right lesson. By the time he got home, the street was quiet, the old porch light buzzing as moths circled in the glow. He climbed out of the truck, took his groceries from the passenger seat, and made his way up the steps. The wooden planks creaked under his boots as he pushed open the door, the cool air of his home greeting him like an old friend. He placed the groceries on the counter, set his keys in the old ceramic dish by the door, and poured himself a glass of water. His body was tired, years of war and age catching up to him, but his mind was still sharp. And he wasn't done yet. EJ walked over to his old desk in the corner of the living room, flipping open his laptop. He went to the DOJ's secure database, entered his credentials, and pulled up a fresh case report. Subject, Deputy Kyle Brooks. Incident. Type, racial profiling / unlawful stop. Status, under review. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he reviewed the details. His body cam footage request had already been submitted. He had also tagged Sergeant Dave Wilkins, who was now officially listed as a witness. He clicked save and leaned back in his chair. The wheels were already in motion. Brooks had no idea how fast this was going to spiral out of his control. The next morning, the ripple effect started. At precisely 7:15 a.m., the chief of police, Robert Harding, sat in his office with a folder on his desk and a headache pounding between his temples. The complaint against Brooks wasn't just another internal issue. It had gone federal. Harding flipped through the pages of the report, shaking his head. Wilkins had already been called in, his statement taken, and though he had tried to distance himself from the whole mess, he couldn't. The report made it clear. He had stood by and let it happen. Then there was Brooks. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. Harding had dealt with cops like him before. Young, arrogant, the kind of guy who thought a badge made him untouchable. It was all fun and games when he was shaking down scared teenagers. But now he had stepped into the wrong fight. Harding set the file down and pressed the intercom button. Send Deputy Brooks in. A moment later, the door swung open and Brooks walked in looking cocky. Harding exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. This kid still had no clue. Brooks smirked, dropping into the chair across from the desk. Morning, Chief. Harding stared at him for a long moment, then finally leaned forward. How stupid are you, son? Brooks blinked. Excuse me? Harding slammed the report onto the desk, making Brooks jump. You know who you stopped last night? Harding growled. Brooks hesitated, then scoffed. Yeah, just some old man with a big mouth, probably exaggerating his war stories. Harding let out a sharp laugh, not out of amusement, out of disbelief. You dumb bastard, he muttered. That man is Earl Jackson, and do you know who he works for? Brooks frowned. Some kind of government thing, Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Harding cut him off, his voice dripping with fury. Brooks went pale. Harding leaned in closer. You racially profiled a federal investigator, and you got caught on body cam doing it. Brooks swallowed hard, his cocky grin vanishing in an instant. Wait, hold on. Oh no, son. Harding's voice was dangerously low. You don't talk now. You had your chance when you ran your mouth to the wrong man last night. Brooks' breathing turned shallow. Look, You are done. Harding's voice boomed through the office. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending further investigation. And you better pray to whatever God you believe in that Jackson doesn't push for full charges, because if he does, you're looking at a federal lawsuit. Brooks slumped back in his chair, shock finally sinking in. Harding exhaled, shaking his head. You thought you were untouchable, but let me tell you something, kid. You ain't. And now, you're about to find out what it feels like to be powerless. Brooks sat there, speechless. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Meanwhile, across town, EJ was sitting at his usual diner, enjoying a quiet breakfast. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, a text from Wilkins. Brooks got suspended. DOJ involvement confirmed. It's happening. EJ smirked, took a slow sip of his coffee, and muttered under his breath. Damn right it is. Because Karma had just walked into the police station, and it had his name written all over it. EJ sat back in his usual corner booth at the diner, stirring his coffee slowly as the morning news played on the small mounted TV above the counter. The place smelled of fresh biscuits and sizzling bacon. But the real satisfaction came from what he had just read on his phone. Brooks was done. He had seen it coming before the kid even knew he was falling, and now, there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. A waitress named Rosie, who'd been working the diner since before EJ had left for his first deployment, walked over and topped off his coffee. You're grinning like you just won the lottery, she teased. EJ chuckled. Something like that? She smirked, shaking her head. You old men and your secrets. EJ just took a sip of coffee and let it burn slow down his throat. Across town, in a cramped fluorescent-lit office at the county sheriff's department, Deputy Kyle Brooks was learning what it felt like to have the ground ripped from under him. His badge sat on the desk in front of him, stripped, suspended. The room was heavy with silence, except for the sound of Chief Harding flipping through reports. He had that same unreadable look on his face, the one that told you he wasn't mad. He was just disappointed, which was worse. Brooks sat stiffly in his chair, still trying to process what was happening. His mouth was dry, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on his knees. Harding finally sighed, setting the file down. "You don't get it, do you?" Brooks swallowed hard. "Sir, You had everything," Harding cut in. "A damn career, a future in this department, a pension at the end of the road, and you threw it away because you couldn't keep your ego in check for 5 minutes." Brooks clenched his jaw. "I didn't—" "You profiled a black veteran, Kyle." Harding's voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. Final. "You pulled him over, harassed him, threatened him, and didn't even stop to think that maybe, just maybe, you were messing with the wrong man." Brooks shifted in his chair. I didn't know who he was." Harding laughed dryly, shaking his head. "That's your problem. You think it matters who he was?" Brooks froze. "It shouldn't have mattered." Harding leaned forward now, his eyes locked onto Brooks like a hammer about to strike. "Whether he was a federal agent or a damn janitor, you had no right to pull him over and treat him like a criminal for driving down the street. That's the part you still don't understand." Brooks looked away, his throat tightening. Harding sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. "You know how many complaints I've buried for you?" Brooks's eyes snapped back to his. "I should have fired you a year ago," Harding muttered. "Maybe then I wouldn't have the damn DOJ breathing down my neck." Brooks sat there, the weight of it all finally settling on his chest. "Effective immediately, you're off the force," Harding said. No hesitation, no wiggle room. "Your suspension just became a permanent dismissal." Brooks gripped the arms of the chair. "Wait. No." Harding shook his head. "You don't get to wait. You don't get second chances when you screw up this bad." Brooks' breath hitched. "This isn't fair." Harding's brows shot up. "Fair?" He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think EJ thought it was fair when you shoved him up against his own truck?" Brooks pressed his lips together, his hands trembling now. Harding exhaled, pushing back from his desk. "Get out of my office." Brooks hesitated. Harding's eyes darkened. "I said, get out." For the first time in his life, Kyle Brooks had no power, no badge, no authority, and nothing left to say. He stood up stiffly, his movements robotic, as if his body wasn't even listening to his mind anymore. Then he turned and walked out, his boots heavy against the floor. The moment he stepped outside, every officer in the department was watching him. Some whispered, some shook their heads, a few didn't even look at him. The walk to the parking lot felt longer than it ever had before. By the time he reached his car and slammed the door shut, his hands were shaking too badly to even start the ignition. He sat there, staring at the empty space where his badge had been. The thing he thought made him powerful. Now, it was nothing but a reminder of everything he lost. Across town, EJ got up from his seat at the diner, threw a 20 on the table, and stretched his back as he stepped outside. The sun was shining. It was going to be a good day. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a quiet, inevitable thing. And today, it had come right on time. The end.